Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Mexico Center here at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event today. The Mexico Center is the premier think tank on Mexico and the binational relationship in the state of Texas, and an obligated point of reference for Mexico expertise in the United States. Our mission is to provide data-driven research and valuable ideas to help in the policymaking process between and in both countries. We do so by leveraging our partnerships among members of both governments, the binational business community, the general public, and of course the media. And we actively engage with the media, in fact, to ensure that we contribute to a productive public discourse on the binational relationship. We have our pulse on a broad range of issues, including the border, migration and human mobility, trade and economic integration, natural resources and the environment, energy, politics and democracy, and of course, the one subject that brings us here today, the rule of law. As you well know, the rule of law is one of the greatest challenges in Mexico today. Now, rule of law is a very broad concept. It encompasses different issues, including institutions designed to enhance checks and balances and constraints on government powers, the absence of corruption, open and transparent government, fundamental due process and human rights, public safety and security for all citizens, a strong and independent regulatory enforcement, an efficient administration of civil justice, and competent criminal justice mechanisms that result in low levels of impunity. On all of these issues, Mexico falls well short. Indeed, going by the indices and media coverage, there is much reason to be pessimistic. But I like to be contrarian when I can afford it. And I have to tell you that I am more optimistic than most, not because things are going well, and perhaps not even because the government of Mexico is doing what it must, but because many citizens on both sides of the border, and certainly in Mexico, are fully dedicated in heart and mind to fighting for the rule of law in Mexico. It is their work from all their different trenches what truly will make a difference. And we at the Mexico Center are committed to provide a voice to all those who want to do well by the binational relationship and who want to strengthen institutions in Mexico. Our doors and our stage are open to all who wish a North America that is strong, prosperous, and secure. And that includes all of us, Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome you all here today to continue our conversation on this important issue, the rule of law. It is not the first event on this important topic. I hope that over the course of the morning, we will have a very productive conversation, and we walk away from this event reinvigorated and energized to continue our hard work in favor of the rule of law in Mexico. To introduce our keynote today, I want to invite our partner for this event. It is a pleasure to introduce Thomas Wilson. Tom came to me about a year ago, no less than that, maybe 8 months ago, from the international law section of the Texas State Bar, and mentioned that they were focusing on Mexico this year. And we worked together to organize an event that they hosted yesterday here in this hall, and this event jointly today. Tom will introduce our keynote speaker, but let me say a word about Tom. We've been in contact for the last few months, working together, Rodrigo Montes de Oca and Tom Wilson and myself, on this particular event. Tom is an accomplished labor and employment lawyer with almost 30 years of experience counseling clients on everything that impacts their businesses, their processes, and their objectives. Tom is sought after by clients outside the United States for advice on their U.S. operations and by U.S. clients for his direction on matters relating to managing global workforce. His representative reach spans Europe, Africa, South America, and Asia, including China. He has a University of Tennessee JD with high honors in 1985 and a Drake University BA in journalism cum laude in 1982. Of course, he's a well-known lawyer in Texas, and he will now come up and introduce our keynote speaker. Tom, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. It has been a pleasure to work with the Baker Institute and the Mexico Center this last year. As Tony said, the International Law section has spent this last year, and in the state bar world, our year runs from June to June, so we work on a little slightly different year. But we have spent this last year really concentrating our studies on Mexico. And let me tell you just a little bit, because I know several of you may be new to the International Law section of the State Bar. We have almost 1,000 members in the State Bar of Texas. We run programs across the state. And this year, as I said, we've concentrated on Mexico, but we've looked at several different topics related to both Mexico and other international law practices. For instance, we had a program in Austin where we addressed technology and legal issues. We had a program in San Antonio where we looked at the health industry and we addressed international issues around the health industry. We also had a program earlier in Houston where we looked at women's rights and the Me Too movement and its impact on international business and legal matters. We recently had another session in Dallas where we looked at immigration, which of course is a major issue in our study of Mexico and Texas. And so we also have a newsletter. We have put out 2 editions so far this year, and a new edition will be coming out next week, in fact, which will be largely concentrating on Mexico. There are 6 articles on different legal issues in Mexico, including the rule of law. And then the big step for us is next week at this time. We will all be in Mexico City for a 3-day event there. So we very much look forward to that. But we have been studying Mexico now for the past year. And in some ways, today sort of feels like we're reaching a peak. We're reaching that point in our study where we were really learning a great deal, and we still have a great deal to learn, but I think today will really advance that cause. And of course, a highlight of this entire year is our next speaker. Justice Eduardo Medina Mora currently stands as a Justice of the Supreme Court of Mexico, a position that he's occupied since his appointment in March 2015. Justice Medina Mora is one of 11 justices on the Supreme Court and a member of the Second Chamber of the Supreme Court. Before his time on the Mexican Supreme Court, Justice Medina Mora served as Mexican ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was also ambassador to the United States. He was also the Attorney General of Mexico. He was also the Secretary of Public Safety. And just for those of you who might not know, that does not mean OSHA. That is a far more important agency in Mexico and is basically the chief law enforcement agency. Justice Medina Mora was also a member of the original NAFTA negotiating team in the early 1990s, serving as an advisor for agriculture, trade, fairness, and investment. When I was looking to introduce Justice Medina Mora, I thought, well, maybe I could compare him to someone in the United States who's held similar positions. And so I did a whole bunch of historical research, and I have to tell you, I failed. I could not find someone in the United States who really has had these types of positions across the board in our government. The closest I could probably find was William Taft, who, of course, was a president and a member of the Supreme Court. But even with him, I think I'd have to add William Taft's father, Alfonso, who was Attorney General for the United States. So if we got both of them in the same room, we might equal Justice Medina Mora, but not quite. We are truly honored to have him here today. And with that, I would like to turn over our continuing studies of Mexico, the rule of law, and invite Justice Medina Mora to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, Justice Medina Mora.
Well, thank you very much Tony, for inviting me to this event. I am very pleased to be back, first of all, in Texas. I have to say that I am 25% Texan because my grandmother was born in Waco and raised in Austin from an Irish family. She married a Mexican, moved to Mexico, had 8 kids, forgot all her English, never really learned Spanish, traded the blue passport for the green one, and well, this is us. Your home. My home. Also, Tom, thank you very much for your very kind introduction, and Rodrigo Montes de Oca, a very good friend, and I'm delighted to share then the panel with highly educated and relevant observers of Mexican reality, Catalina Perez Correa, Carlos Bravo, Eduardo Bojorquez, and my colleague David Garcia Sarubi. First of all, just a word on what Tom said in terms of comparing me with Taft. I do not intend to be president. I have not been one. The only aim I have in life is to be happy. So, and for sure that is not conducive to that. So I do not intend even to be president of the Supreme Court or Chief Justice. I really want to remain as I am today. Well, first a comment. Of course, my talk is titled From the Bench. Well, the court is a political institution that is part of the judiciary. And of course, the history and tradition from which justices come to the bench are very different. Some of them have been judges for 40 or 45 years. Some come from the academia, some come from private practice. I come from I don't know where, as you can see from my... But you always come from your history. You always come from your interpretation of the world, which is based on values and ideas that were given to you by family and school, and also your work experiences. So I have had a very diverse career, and this, of course, gives me one specific lesson, which is to respect facts, reality. A good friend of mine, who a few years ago was Undersecretary for Intelligence in the Department of Defense in the US, told me, Eduardo, you know what's the problem? Reality is classified. And it is. It's really classified. And it's very stubborn. Extremely stubborn. So at the end, when you face problems, we tend very frequently to approach them with problems that are very complex, multidimensional, that are very difficult to understand. But the approach is to address them with a very simple explanation, simplified, I would say, that, of course, is very easy to understand, and everyone says, well, yes, but it's totally wrong. So it takes you to the wrong areas of policy around reality. And reality is classified. You have to dig a little bit more. So from respect to reality, I want to share some views. And I think that you have to take a step back in terms of conceptual building up of understanding reality. And this is about security and, of course, justice. Finally, before doing this, I was in the FIL, the Feria Internacional del Libro of Guadalajara, presenting a book that I translated, Tom Bingham, The Rule of Law. Tom Bingham was Chief Lord Justice of the UK, and I met him in 2010 when I was ambassador there, and he wrote a fantastic book because it is very easy to understand. And I said to my friends in Tirán Lo Blanche, the editors, that I wanted to do this, and they got the rights, and we did. This is the last time I will translate a book. It's much easier to write a book than to translate a book, because you have to. But Tom Bingham had this fantastic British sense of humor. And he said, well, this rule of law thing sounds like something good more than bad, but really no one understands that. And we have to actually dissect the components and then also understand the traditions that are behind each concept. We have a very different tradition. We translate into Spanish the rule of law as Estado de Derecho. And most of us lawyers think of Estado de Derecho as the state with capital S. So the institution that is behind the government and, of course, the branches of government, not about what is reality. So Tom Bingham said, well, ordinary citizens understand this very well because they know perfectly well when there is none. There is no rule of law, for sure. And they, of course, understand this because that comes from the lack of certainty. So let's take a step back in terms of what is the ultimate goal for the state. Well, it's to develop a stable and prosperous society. So the economic structure and politics are aimed to a constant raise of the well-being and protection of citizens, which means access to specific services and rights, health, education, opportunity, raise in per capita GDP, but of course that's only an average. And we have a few preconditions for anything nice or decent to happen. And these preconditions are quite relevant. One is macroeconomic stability. If we don't have macroeconomic stability, we're done. And this is a combination of a sound monetary policy with an independent body that we have already, the Banco de Mexico, and of course, fiscal stability, which is a responsible managing of public resources in terms of spending. The combination of both provides macroeconomic stability. This is considered a given today, but it was not. Back in 1995, I, together with someone who became Secretary of the Treasury afterwards, wrote a paper that fortunately was not published, and then no one remembers that, but we were proposing to adopt the dollar as the currency of the land because there was no hope for us. And we didn't, fortunately. And then we have today a relatively sound macroeconomic environment from a sound institution, which is the Bank of Mexico. Now, to build this, it takes a generation. To destroy this takes 5 minutes. And this is something, it's considered a given, but it's not a given. The other precondition, of course, is security and justice. And this is the most important debt that the Mexican state has with its own citizenship. And this is something that is not working, has not worked, has not ever worked, and we have to then understand what is behind this to really approach this in a virtuous way. But just to say that all these preconditions and, of course, the right policies should drive to economic growth. Without economic growth, it is impossible to raise the standard of living. It is impossible to sustain anything. And of course, economic growth allows social mobility for groups and people, and this is the context in which this is done. And of course, the legitimacy of a government, which is the perception that the political and social arrangement and the economic arrangement is adequate and aiming towards the public interest. And this is, of course, based on three principles, which are a strong state, which is there is no rights, there is no freedoms without state, because you have to have an articulation of society that provides with these basic guarantees for citizens. The rule of law, of course, as wide as you can take it, and accountability. These are, to my view, the most important components of what is a good government that might lead to this perception that this arrangement is aiming towards the public interest. And of course, you have to see that the rule of law in this sense needs to provide certainty to ordinary citizens. First, in terms of my relationship with any authority, any government body, that my rights, my human rights, are going to be respected every time I deal with someone who has a representation or some sort of position in the government. That my ability to solve disputes with other human beings, other citizens, can approach and access a system that is working, that has rules, that has a structure that allows me, with a reasonable cost, to solve my disputes, and also to enforce what we do every day, which is we make promises to each other, promises in a reciprocal way, what we lawyers call contracts. And you have to enforce contracts, and you need a body that actually helps you with enforcing these promises with certainty, with rules that are there before you have a problem, and of course at a reasonable cost. And then you also have to deal with the ability of the state itself to defend public institutions from non-governmental bodies or organizations or expressions that, of course, compete with the state for the three most basic powers of the state that should not be lent or delegated to anyone. And in some areas of my country and some other countries, this is not the case. Of course, the monopoly of the legitimate use of power, this cannot be shared with anyone. This is a state matter. The power to enact rules of general application, laws. There is, in some cases, the law of the land is not what was enacted by Congress. It's what someone else says. And of course, the power to collect taxes. In a way, extortion in certain areas, it's a tax, because they are extracting rents from otherwise legal activities by ordinary citizens. So these powers, you cannot define there is a state without this. And then we have to actually work around this to make sure that we have the rule of law and we have this state that is going to provide certainty and the structure to defend this idea. So in this sense, my view is that in terms of security, the basic problem is that we do not understand what is going on. I didn't understand when I was in charge of that, or I understand much better now than I do. You have an operational approach because you are in charge of actually doing things, but also thinking about what is really the problem. And I would say that the most important problem is territorial control, which is the state able to make sure that it's going to be the state which solves or sets the environment from which citizens do what they do on an everyday basis. And this territorial control has never been there in our country. We have a very fragmented, and I would say flawed system of distribution of law enforcement. I would say the coercive power of the state, the principle of authority, as we say in Spanish, which is a responsibility from the constitutional perspective shared by the federation, the states, and municipalities. This is a bad idea. Municipalities didn't have this responsibility always. This came from a 1983 constitutional reform during the administration of President de la Madrid, and it was thought, well, no one is doing this. Maybe the political body that is closer to citizens should take care of this. And then they established as a responsibility for municipalities public security. They were in charge of what was called the bandos de policía y buen gobierno. I don't know if there is a translation for that, but it is to take care of traffic, drunks, and just, ordinary low order within geography. But they were not responsible for public security. And then from different amendments until 1998 and 99, we formed this national system of public security that distributed federal funds to states and municipalities, and then the municipalities are expected to have a police force, but then we have a rule in the Constitution that police officers do not have certainty in terms of their right to stay in the job, because they can be fired anytime. And of course, they have to be given a severance payment, but they cannot fight in court to really, this is not with cause and you're not right. So it is a very bad incentive for doing the wrong thing. We would need to get rid of municipal police forces, in my view. We need a more concentrated force. President Felipe González, who was president of Spain, came to Mexico quite often in the late 90s. And I had a very close relationship with him. And he told me once, well, Eduardo, a democracy needs to have a very large and powerful police in order not to use it, just to establish the fact that the state owns the territory. And mine is bigger than yours, so watch out. In that sense, we don't have a good institutional or constitutional arrangement in terms of the organization of the coercive power of the state. And of course, we have taken that wrongly to the military. I remember an admiral, Admiral Vázquez del Mercado, who was Secretary of the Navy in the 60s, that used to say, from a different perspective, but I love the phrase, everything that is provisional becomes permanent in time. Well, that's exactly what has happened to us. And now we are struggling to define how we can actually control, how can we actually give a path in terms of time and in terms of task to military-related forces doing a job for which they are not trained. It is not their legal objective, and they shouldn't be doing that. But no one else is, so we have to deal with that. In this sense, we have just passed, well, the Congress has just passed a constitutional reform establishing the National Guard. And I will end my comments just with a distinction, because this is something that is not obvious. to my view, and this is a democratic tradition also, there is nothing wrong to have militarized law enforcement public security bodies. Many European countries have that. In France, la gendarmerie was originally formed as a body within the Ministry of Defense, military in structure, military in discipline, but separated from the armed forces. So what is forbidden by Mexican Constitution and resolutions from the Inter-American Human Rights Court and human rights treaties that Mexico is part of, and then they are mandatory, binding for us at a constitutional level, is to use the armed forces in public security job, which is different than using military bodies or militarized bodies in terms of structure and discipline to do certain jobs. And this works because the aim of the objective of these bodies is totally different than the police force. So France moved the gendarmerie from the Ministry of Defense to the Interior back in 2009. Spain had the Guardia Civil. It was formed within the Ministry of Defense. But 18 years ago, it moved to public security, and still a militarized body, but has nothing to do with the armed forces, except that it was formed within the Ministry of Defense. In Italy, the Carabinieri are part of the Ministry of Defense, but are totally separated from the armed forces. So you have to distinguish between the department, the ministry, the secretary, and the bodies. In Mexico, the armed forces have their own organic law, their own law that organizes them, which is different than the one that creates the Ministry of Defense, that is created within the law that establishes the different branches of the executive as ministries or departments. So one thing is the department, a different thing is the armed forces, a different thing is certain activities which are not military in nature, but that can be actually be managed by the departments of defense, or support civilian efforts, as this is the case. We have to see what happens in the secondary law in the Guardia Nacional, and the devil is in the details. I say, I have been repeating to my friends there, please do not merge the Guardia Nacional with the federal police. It's a totally different body and game. The aim for the Guardia Nacional is territorial control, actually border and the crossroads. There are 50 crossroads in Mexico that actually everything goes through there. Well, you have to focus there. And of course, strategic facilities, but not do and then provide for the space, the security space, territorial control space, human and political, to make possible that states or whomever is responsible, I said that municipal entities are a very wrong approach to this because they are too fragmented, to build up what we need, which is a decent civilian police force that can actually do their job. So I have many other things to say, but I won't. So this is it. Absolutely.
Great. Let me start with a few questions, and then I'll open the conversation to that. You're a provocateur in many ways. So I'll start with one of the things that you mentioned, and it has to do with the Guardia Nacional, or the National Guard. I'm not sure what the translation would be, but it's this new militarized police force that Mexico is putting into place as we speak. So is it something different than the federal police, or is it kind of merging the federal police, which you're quite familiar with, and are they under the Department of Defense, or are they going to be collaborating closely? I mean, the uniforms that were presented look a lot like it. Can you kind of sort out what the landscape, the institutional landscape, and the interconnections among all these different groups is going to look like when the Mexican Congress is done with legislating all this?
predicting the future is a very risky business. I will answer your question, I don't know. The fact is that the constitutional amendment only refers to the National Guard. It is not mentioning the federal police except for providing for the objectives of the National Guard as those which are listed in the law of the federal police. So we have to see what is going to be the proposal to Congress in terms of rule this out. I think, and I hope, and I have stated, that they do not merge the National Guard with the federal police. The profile of the people are totally different. We need something to take care of territorial control, but that's totally different than actually going after drug traffickers or organized crime or doing many other tasks that are, of course, for the federal police. And the judicial police, the investigation police, needs someone with a professional profile. While taking care of territorial control, you need someone with high school. I mean, you don't need the same profile of people. You can, of course, have that in the same body, but it is very difficult. A culture always, when you merge companies, you can do that. I have done that. You can merge 3 companies, not more. And of course, the culture and the way of killing bugs in one company prevails over the others, always. Not necessarily the same people, but the way you approach things in a business, if you merge it with others, will prevail. And that is a rule of thumb. And in this sense, it would be a very bad idea, and I think what I have heard, there is a lack of understanding of what is good and what is bad around the federal police. I think that we have very good things, and we have very bad things. But if you actually disappear that by merging with the National Guard, I think it's a terrible idea. Now, having the National Guard within the public security ministry, which seems to be going to be the case, it's perfectly fine. Even if it's a militarized body, this is what happens in other countries. It doesn't have to be this way. In Colombia, for instance, the national police is a part of the Ministry of Defense, but it's totally separated from the armed forces. The culture is different. The head of the national police in Colombia is a general, but it's not an army general. He's a police general. And they are called the same, but have nothing to do in terms of culture, in terms of how. The difference is really, if you do a police work, you have to have police rules of engagement, which are totally different than military rules of engagement. Now, the military can train people to follow rules of engagement which are police-oriented. They have done that in the past. I can witness that because the most relevant part of the federal police when I was Secretary of Public Security was the military. But they had a totally different training and approach. And of course, things happen all the time, but when you send the military, people that were trained with a military approach, well, more bad things happen than when you send someone who has a different approach into these rules of engagement.
I don't think that in the United States we do not know the experience of heavily militarized or military-like law enforcement. I can think of the Coast Guard, which in fact in times of war comes under the Defense Department, and they kind of look like military guarding the sea, the territorial sea, but at the same time, they're really a law enforcement body. So there's some experiences, and you also mentioned the gendarmerie in France and the carabinieri in Italy and so on. So there's clearly experiences that Mexico can learn from and hopefully learn quickly. One question that worries me is something that has been suggested, the political use of not just police structures, but this frontal attack on corruption and this building of institutions. We saw a small bit of this temptation. Obviously, that was, the law enforcement was really a political tool, not an administration of justice tool for Mexico for many years. Will we find this temptation still there to use these new institutions for political purposes? And I think that's kind of a serious concern that most of us have as we watch Mexico struggling with creating the right institutions.
This is a concern that we share. I can only say that. Let's hope that the military, the people in the armed forces that will put the resources to do this, but with a different approach, and the chain of command will not be under them. That's mandated already in the Constitution. Do not fall into that temptation. And their behavior has been institutional. The only concern I would have with that, I share your concern fully, is that if you give the armed forces a lot of money and a lot of power, well, everyone that receives a lot of money and a lot of power likes that, and then you don't want to leave that.
Right.
That's the only.
Former President Peña Nieto said that in Mexico, corruption was simply cultural. And we just had to, I guess, learn to live with it. That was part of the landscape. And I guess this is also suggesting partly that it's never going to change. We may be able to manage it, but in the end, it is part of the Latin and the Mexican culture. Is that true? Can it truly be eradicated?
That's not true, of course. I fully disagree with that. I think it is possible, but then you need to work with process, with what is to be done by each public servant in whatever they do in an orderly way that is actually measured and controlled. So you have to narrow the discretionary power of public officers, because if you have a large discretionary power, you make mistakes. Some mistakes are because you're not well trained, are not mistakes that you are actually doing that on purpose. It just happens. And then some mistakes are done on purpose from a corruption perspective. If you reduce the discretionary ability of public officers to do that, and it can be done, the new technology in terms of actually doing this online, and you cannot follow a different pattern, but this reduces this space of corruption and, of course, mistakes. So it improves the effectiveness and the efficacy of the state. And, of course, it reduces corruption. There are some cultural approaches, maybe history, but I do not think, and I have witnessed this personally, I assure you there is a way out. You have to work hard. It's a matter of organizing the public decision-making process from a very controlled environment, reducing these discretionary abilities for whomever makes the decision. There is always a discretion level, but if you reduce it to a proper level, it works.
Well, those of us who studied political science and law classes within our political science degrees like to study and have taken classes on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Mexico is not today unlike the Supreme Court of the United States. So a number of judges, and then you guys hear the cases and receive all the evidence and do your analysis, and then you write your opinions. And there's dissent, and there's majorities, and so on. Recently, I think you led the effort on social media case, Twitter specifically. And we've seen it in the United States. President Trump used to block his critics, and then a federal judge ruled that he may not block his critics from his Twitter account because that is a mechanism that people use today to hold politicians accountable. And that's more or less where we stand today, although obviously the Trump administration has appealed, and they really truly want to not hear the voices that they need to hear. So you led this case. Can you tell us what the facts of the case were, your own legal thinking process, and how you came to your opinion in this particular case? And that will give us a good insight into what happens in the entrails of the Mexican Supreme Court.
Absolutely. This was a case that was actually tried by a journalist interested in human rights violations and major issues in the state of Veracruz, that was blocked by the Attorney General, the prosecutor of the state of Veracruz. And
on Twitter, he blocked.
on Twitter,
Okay.
yes. The prosecutor of the state of Veracruz had this Twitter account well before he was the Attorney General for the state, the prosecutor. It was a private account. But then, when he took the job, he wrote Ricardo Winkler. It was not Ricardo, but general prosecutor, father, husband, and lover of justice. Well, and he started publishing data or photos on events as a prosecutor. So he transformed his account from a private account to a public account. Once you do that, you're done. You cannot block anyone. This is the core criteria, anyone. Why is that? Well, because this is the way you are communicating. You might choose not to have a Twitter account. I don't have one. I follow Twitter very closely, but I don't write anything. And I challenge if you find my identity. I am just a voyeurista, voyeur. But if you publish information around your job as a public officer, you're done. This is a public account, and then you cannot block anyone. This was essentially the decision. Because, of course, there is a right of privacy. If Mr. Winkler had a private account where he publishes photos of his kids and whatever, and then a public account that he uses for, then we didn't deal with that, but you would have a case for protecting the right of privacy, and public officers do have the right of privacy. But if you use this account or whatever social media account, because it would you cannot block people. Of course, Facebook, you might actually manage who you accept. Here, you don't. So that was the resolution of the court, unanimously taken, and I guess that was the right one. And it sets now.
Is the Veracruz journalist unblocked now?
Yeah, he was unblocked 5 minutes after we took the decision.
Okay. Well, great. So it's a way in which we now hold our officials accountable. I think we're definitely living in a new environment. And even as you're talking about Mexico trying to get its police institutions and its administration of justice institutions together, technology is moving ahead. And so Mexico is split between the mid 20th century, early 21st century, and of course these kinds of mechanisms which look a lot more like 2050 or something like that. So,
just one thing on this. Technology advancements, particularly in information technology, are very democratic. It's very difficult to develop them, but they are at the reach of almost anyone. So if you use that, countries like ours can actually advance very rapidly if you use technology to help you ordering process and ordering behavior of public officers. The public bidding system, which is a disaster, could be improved dramatically with technology. The British, by the way, have a fantastic system that allows them to be very transparent and very effective on the awarding public bidding contracts, and then managing the execution of those contracts as well.
there is this is not an unimportant topic when it comes to the rule of law. I remember in Tamaulipas, for example, where journalists have a very difficult time reporting on the violence and the crime that occurs in the state. Citizens have organized and they become kind of consumers of information and reporters. and they use Twitter accounts to report specific spots where there's shootouts, executions, police presence, and they communicate very quickly. And so people receive this information. So in some ways, all citizens are journalists now, as they are consumers of information, and they magnify the presence of these tools, and not just to inform each other to stay out of danger, but also to hold officials and officers and politicians accountable. And that was an interesting case that came that fell on your lap, and I was curious about how you decided that case. We have a few more minutes if you have any questions for the Supreme Court Justice. Medina Mora, please.
Yes, sir.
Do we have let me see, do we have a microphone there so that everybody can hear? You have a microphone?
I'll try to speak up.
Okay, there you go.
If I understood you correctly, you said that a fragmented, localized police force is not your preference for Mexico. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I say to myself, well, that's exactly what we have in this country. From the Rice University Police to the West University Police to the Houston Police to the Harris County Sheriff to the state troopers, we have levels and levels of citizen-controlled police. They're all military trained. Every two-bit municipality's got a SWAT team, and they love their SWAT training. And so that's the American system. And it seems, you know, when we think about federal police officers here, we think of the FBI, but we never see them. And you see federal officers with guns at the airport occasionally, and I'm obviously on the border, but that we really don't have much of a federal police force presence publicly. And so I wonder why you're critical of that system being adopted in Mexico, where local citizenry can control the corruption.
Thank you.
Because, I mean, you are totally right. The US has 24,000 different police entities. We have 2,000, and the British have 43, and they think there are too many. All depends on which kind of problems you're facing. The issue is that the US system developed from the US society and how you deal with the social fabric within communities, and also the tradition of how you deal with the state. I am not a fan of the Second Amendment, but you can explain that from original citizens trying to limit the state in terms of how the state deals with them. It's a bad idea, but that's a different circumstance. The issue here is, for the problems we face, and from the fact that no one took care of territorial control in Mexico ever. When the revolution started, there was the rurales of Porfirio Diaz, and everyone was afraid of them. And then the revolutionaries discovered that there was no one there. And they could do the thing, and they did. So this was never organized. The coercive power of the state in Mexico was organized in a very wise political design by President Cárdenas, and then really completed by President Abela Camacho and Alemán, that divided the coercive power of the state into four. They had the Ministry of Defense, or the Ministry of War, and they divided that into two. The Ministry of Defense with the Army and the Air Force, and then the Ministry of the Navy with the Navy. And the first two secretaries of the Navy were generals, not admirals. And then those two different entities, departments, reported directly to the president, who had direct command. So he could balance one with the other. And then they had a very large police force in Mexico City, because the command and appointment of the Mexico City police chief was made by the president. So we have a very large police force, as large as New York, 45,000 guys really in the streets. And of course, the Estado Mayor and the Presidential Guards, that were a very well-trained body back then. The only aim was not citizen protection. It was not citizen protection. It was to protect the president from military coups. And we did that well, but we never took care of ordinary citizens doing their thing. I mean, being happy in their communities. The right to live in peace and tranquility in your community with your family. And that is, we don't have that. We have this highly fragmented design, which is not working. If you are a very nice guy and you are elected mayor of Guadalupe, Nuevo León, or wherever in the north, and you hire 280 police officers, which is what you have from the Tec de Monterrey, very nice kids. You actually make sure by psychological exams and others that their moms did a good job in terms of educating them in values, and then you send them to Cuántico or to Avila because they get the best training. They come back, they stand no chance, I assure you, because in front of them you have 1,500 guys from the other side who have fantastic weapons, not necessarily manufactured in the US, but coming from the US, that outgun anyone. So you stand no chance. Size matters. And this is why, for instance, Mexico City is much better or less worse than other areas of the country because it has a very large police force that works. But there is always room and there are problems there, but the design of having a highly fragmented coercive power of the state is totally wrong for all the problems we face. I'm not criticizing the US, it comes from history. In Europe, you don't have this fragmentation as you have here. It comes from.
I think it also bring the microphone over here. It is an important question nonetheless, because I think if you look at your job as a Supreme Court justice, you have to weigh all the different principles that may sometimes run against each other. And so one thing is to have a federal police for territorial control, but what is the right comparison? Spain, Italy, Colombia, for example, remain unitary systems, whereas Mexico is a federal system that looks a lot more like the United States institutionally. So how do you create this kind of centralized, strong military police force for territorial control without really pushing up against the principle of federalism? And so how do you balance these things?
I don't know.
Right here, yeah, go ahead. You have the microphone, and then please pass the microphone over here to Dr. López. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you can talk all you want to about how you want to organize law enforcement in Mexico, but your real problem is corruption. It's rampant throughout your law enforcement agencies in Mexico, and I am surprised in your answer about corruption you didn't talk about aggressive prosecution. That was the answer found in Brazil. Aggressive prosecution has really done a good job in Brazil with regard to corruption. But in Mexico, I don't hear about that. And it really affects companies that are doing business in Mexico. It's a huge, huge problem. Can't even use the highways without paying the police to use the highways for transporting equipment, for instance. So what is going to be done about corruption? I mean, seriously done.
Oh, thank you. Over here, pass the microphone over here, and then we'll have the answer. Arrest and prosecution. Give me 1 second,
Yes.
Alfonso.
Okay.
We'll wait for the answer, please.
Oh, okay. I addressed the police problem, police in the territory, the exercise of the monopoly of the legitimate use of force by the state. I didn't address corruption. Corruption is part of the police problem, but it's not, to my view, it's a result, it's not the origin. If you have a very not a strong police force, a very weak police force, very small. Well, if you go to Michoacán, where an organized crime group has territorial control, and you are the mayor of a town and you have your police force, well, these groups actually have control on your police force, on your public works office, and your ability to also collect whatever taxes you have as a municipality, and you stand no chance. So that's part of the problem. You need to provide the framework from which you can build decent institutions. Of course, to fight corruption goes through investigation and prosecution, I have no doubt. But having done that in Brazil, you have to tell me that if Brazil and Guatemala, for instance, that have actually prosecuted former presidents, are better off today than they were 20 years ago. My answer is no. Why not? Because the system, the procedures are not there. Of course, if it is important to actually prosecute people who have done wrong things, sure, and I would back that fully. But it's not good enough. You need more than that. And that's, in terms of building up a police force, you need system, procedures, and size. And that is why, going back to your federalism, well, you can have a very large national police, but then you would have to convince governors and state political forces that they have to yield those powers to the federation. I mean, that's conceptually possible, but politically totally unviable. That won't happen. So I would say that the answer should be a state police force, but you could conceptually build up a national police force, even being a federal country. You have to change the political arrangement. Now, I don't think that those with the power of doing that in the states are willing to yield that to anyone.
Alfonso, and then we'll go over here. Yeah.
Justice, thank you so much for these inspiring words. You said that too large discretionary powers can produce mistakes, normally in the administration. And that is why the process and the regulatory, la potestad reglada, the regulatory power of the administration should be reinforced. But the more I have approached the administration, most of the cases I've seen that the lack of flexibility and a certain margin of discernment makes sometimes the fact that applying by the book gets a wrong answer, not adapted to the situation. What is your opinion about this notion that the French Prime Minister used 5 years ago at some point when in a strike, police charged some persons that were in the manifestation and said police lacked discernment in this moment of action. Discernment means like a sort of intelligence of the administration. What would be your idea of including this discernment? How could we have this discernment of the administration in a normal administrative procedure? And knowing if you consider this discernment to be compliant, can be the administration flexible and be compliant?
That's precisely a very good example of a very complex, multi-layered problem that is approached in a very simplistic way. And then you don't understand something, you overregulate that. That's not the answer. And my approach was not to remove all regulations or to regulate everything. It was just to design an approach which is process-based and use the information technology tools to reduce the discretionary. You have to make decisions every single step, but those decisions are within a framework. So it is not that you are impeded to do your job because the regulation is not allowing you to do so. Of course, over-regulation of something or the wrong regulation is worse than lack of regulation. But today, you see direct assignment of public bidding. Well, is that the answer? I don't think so, but I mean, you could do that, and that's within the regulation as well. So you have to go a step backwards and then revisit every single process and then try to define how this process is going to be managed. And of course, you would reduce mistakes, both from corruption or from the lack of understanding or ability. That's my view. And of course, this is a view that comes from my private sector experience. If you want to produce whatever, I mean, tomato paste, as I did, or raise hogs, well, you don't actually try to, you have to do and follow a process which is very strict. Otherwise, you won't have the result you're looking to.
Here, and then Nicolas, yes.
Is it not a fact, sir, that your preference for a nationalistic police is derived from an ancient legal tradition which predominates in Latin America, and that is the legal tradition of imperial Rome? And from that Roman tradition, you would necessarily have a nationalistic police force. And there are other components of that tradition which also have an effect on those doing business at the border between Mexico and the United States. For example, in common law countries, the private parties do their own contracting. Their contract is not imposed upon them by imperialistic power. With that, for example, in the US Constitution, there is a specific provision derived from the common law, not philosophy, but from the common law, which specifies that there should be no impairment of the obligation of contracts. No ex post facto laws are to be applied retroactively to redefine contractual terms that were written by the parties themselves on a prior date. That being the case, sir, would it not be advisable for Mexico to seriously consider possibly incorporating important aspects of the common law for the purposes of contracting and other matters that affect police force and the rights of citizens to avoid the corruption of police forces? I'd like to get your comments, sir.
Thank you. Well, first of all, my approach is not a nationalistic. It is just that having, in terms of police forces, having a municipal approach is not right because it results in a highly fragmented power. I'm not saying that the federal government should take care of that. That is not defined. It should be either the federal government with a national police, which is, I said, unviable, or the states with a local state police force, governors taking care of that. And this has nothing to do with the ability of private parties to contract with each other. Contracts are designed by private parties, of course, within the law. You can sign a contract to kill me, but that's illegal. You have limits within the law. And of course, if you want to enforce them, you have to follow those limits, because otherwise courts won't enforce your contract, even though that. So this is coming also from a very the same democratic liberal tradition. Of course, our system is not a common law, and that doesn't make us, in that sense, less democratic than you. I was ambassador to the UK. That is the common law. I respect a lot of the common law, but Germany and France are not coming from the common law, are not dictatorships. They are not. They are actually countries that are governed by the rule of law, but from different traditions. We have just taken into our system, for instance, the adversarial accusatorial system for criminal prosecution from 2008. It's not yet working very much, but I think it was much better than what we had before. It is much better. And this is coming from the common law tradition. It is not coming from the Roman tradition that was then organized or developed by Germany or France in that sense. So I don't think that this is something that is going against or apart from the common law. It's just doing the rational thing, and you get experiences from other areas of the world, different traditions, and of course the result has to be the respect for human rights, the respect for human citizens and freedoms, but without the state. Hannah Arendt, a German philosopher who was very active in the US, said there are no rights and liberties without the state. They are not, because there's something that is taken for granted, shouldn't be.
I'm going to take the last two questions, Nicholas, and please pass the microphone over here to George, and then I think we'll take a little break and then come back to the panel. Nicholas.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for being here. It's been a wonderful experience to hear you and hear you share your knowledge and experience with us. I have first a comment and then a question. The comment is about the fragmentation of police forces or police forces within the United States. And in this city, we have a very interesting example of that in that our local police refuse to function as officers of the immigration agency. Now, this is much, that is much criticized by certain sectors of the government, but our mayor, our chief of police have all said, we don't want our local police to be enforcing federal law in the case of immigration. I see this as a positive outcome. The question I have, I've heard the term rule of law translated in Spanish in two different ways. One is the way that you used, Estado de Derecho, but another term I've heard quite often is imperio de la ley. Now, it seems there's a useful distinction there against what might be called rights and what might also be called the laws, since the laws are constantly evolving in some sense or another, whereas there are certain basic rights, to use terminology common to this country, that are inalienable. So I'm wondering if it's useful to keep that distinction between rights and law, and if it has any practical application value.
Great. Can we get George's question, and then we'll close with this final answer. George, please.
Thank you, Mr. Justice. In the course of doing a research on a report on the history of legislation dealing with anti-corruption in Mexico, I had the occasion to look at the Military Code of Justice, and I was surprised to see that the term corruption does not exist in the Military Code of Justice. So the question is, in the general presumption and evidence of corruption in the military, how is the military to guard against and correct and deal with corruption in its own ranks, or if it's not, who's responsible? Thank you.
First of all, I do like the imperio de la ley, and I think it reflects more what the rule of law is about. In Spanish, you don't use this. Johnny Sutton told me yesterday. Thank you. A very good friend who was district attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice when we were dealing with these issues a few years back. But in Spanish, you can say el estado de cosas. So it's not the estado de derecho as a state with capital S, it's el estado de cosas, which is how or what ordinary citizens perceive as going on, imperio de la ley. So no one is above the law. Everyone is subject to the law. Even minorities have to subject themselves in terms of their exercise of power to the law and respect minority rights. So in that sense, yes, but we have a tradition in which we talk about the Estado de Derecho, but it's always or typically referred not to the imperio de la ley, but to the state with capital S. So that's the only distinction. If you see in precedents in court, while seguridad jurídica or legal security has been used within the resolutions of the Supreme Court like 3,000 times in the last 25 years, you only see Estado de Derecho 225 times. So that's it's something good, more than something bad, but no one really understands. So we have to dissect this to understand that this is, and Tom Bingham's phrase I love, ordinary citizens understand perfectly well when there is none. That's for sure, that is a good explanation. Now, in terms of corruption itself, it's a concept, it's not a crime. From corruption, you list a lot of different behaviors that are crimes. And then you have to define very precisely what a crime is. So if you appropriate public funds illegally, well, that's a case of corruption, but the crime is not corruption. In the military, essentially, the same behaviors are listed as crimes, but they are listed as discipline problems. So if you steal from the military, you're actually committing, or you're actually breaking the discipline, and then you're punished. This is just a conceptual issue. And of course, when they see themselves, when they observe themselves, the corruption is something that is unthinkable for someone who is serving the military, because the military, and of course this happens for sure. I mean, it happens in every human organization. But it is not that you don't have particular legal crime definitions from which you can prosecute the behavior, which is what matters. It's just that the title of the code is not corruption, while in the federal criminal code, yes, there is a title corruption, but then the behaviors or the crimes are not defined as corruption, are just part of this phenomena.
Great. Well, let's take 5 minutes to refresh our cups of coffee and grab a little sugar over there and come back to the panel. Thank you so much, and thank you very much.
Thank you.